Hey kids, Uncle Clockwork here, and welcome back to another episode of Dungeons & Dragons 1980s style. So in this episode I was going to show you a few more things that you would have had in your collection if you were playing Dungeons & Dragons back in the 80s. Now, before I get started, I feel like I should mention something that I failed to mention in our first episode. Very critical to playing the game. There were two versions of the game, and I believe there might be two versions now. There's a basic set and there's an advanced set. The basic set, just Dungeons and Dragons, would have been the basic box set, and it is a simplified version of the game. You don't have to deal with things like races. As a matter of fact, like elf and halfling were a playable class in the original basic version. And of course, once you got the hang of it, then you graduate on to the more advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which were the hardback books. And really then, you didn't really need many books to play the game. The basic set, really, you would only need the Player's Handbook and the Dungeons & Master's Guide. The Dungeons & Master's Guide actually had a few monsters in it, so technically you could use that to play the game, but eventually you would need a monster's manual if you wanted to, throw more at your players. So Dungeons and Dragons, again, kind of two versions, but it was basically you'd start off with a basic set, get familiarized, graduate on to the more advanced set. Now, did your old Uncle Clockwork play in the modules that were available? Or did he play in his own campaign, or campaigns that others ran out of their own imagination? A little bit of both, actually. And ever since the first installment, I've been receiving questions about what modules I played in and what were my favorites. Well, honestly, they were all great. They all had special meaning to me. But there were at least 5 that I can think of that I'm going to share with you as my top 5 Dungeons & Dragons modules of the 1980s. So here we go. Now the first module I ever purchased was U1, The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. And to this day it still remains one of my most favorite modules of all time. Reason being, this is what I call the Scooby-Doo module. Okay? This is a very low-level module. I think it's for adventures levels 1 to 3. So it's a beginner's level adventure. And it runs very much like a Scooby-Doo episode. A town calls in a group of adventurers because they've seen strange lights in an old haunted mansion on a hill. And they think that, ghostly activity has started, up and will spread to the town. So they want someone to go investigate. Everybody they send up there doesn't come back. So a hardy band of adventurers goes up there and check out the haunted mansion. And it's very Scooby-Doo because everyone thinks it's haunted. Turns out to be a guy in a mask. Not going to ruin it for you, but that's basically the plot line. I think now in the 5th edition, they've continued this whole Saltmarsh tradition. There's a whole area, a whole set of adventures, coastal waters, lizard men, pirates, that kind of thing. But really, for a good beginner's adventure, I highly recommend The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. Alright kids, number 2 on the list is Ravenloft. As you know, your Uncle Clockwork is an old horror fan, and this is a good creature feature. This really is reminiscent of the old Universal movie monsters, or Hammer horror films. Christopher Lee Dracula or Bela Lugosi Dracula. That's what this module is modeled after. And it is the classic Transylvanian tale where the adventurers wander into the distraught village and must overcome an ancient curse, and at the center of it there's a vampire. There is actually a second module in the series from the original Ravenloft 2, House on Griffin Hill. That one incorporates more of a Dr. Frankenstein, Jekyll Hyde feel, and is set in more of a English Victorian countryside as opposed to like a Bavarian town. And there's a weird way that you can actually run the two together, which I won't spoil for you. Go ahead, check it out, look it up. Ravenloft, number 2 on the list. Alright kids, number 3 on the list would be Pharaoh. This one starts off the Desert of Desolation series. It's a trilogy. Personally, I think they kind of peter out. The first one is the best in the trilogy, and it is one of my favorites. Pharaoh basically is a story of adventurers who, kind of forced into the desert on a political mission, encounter the spirit of a dead pharaoh, and who begs them to lift the curse on his kingdom, which he inadvertently placed. They must raid his pyramid tomb and recover a jeweled item within. Basically, it's the best desert adventure that you could probably run from the 80s. I mean, really, they put a lot of thought into this, about the experience of the wasteland, and a bunch of desert folklore from Persia and the Middle East goes into this. Jinn, Ifrit, that kind of thing. And really, it's a good, Indiana Jones style tomb raiding expedition that you have to go on. So I highly encourage it if you're looking for that feel in your campaign. Pharaoh. Alright kids, number 4 on the list of Uncle Clockwork's favorite modules from the 80s. One from the master, Gary Gygax himself. Now, a lot of people like to point towards Tomb of Horrors as being their favorite Gygax dungeon crawl. Me, no. I have to point to this one. This one is much more horrific, much more fast-paced and deadlier, and really it's like every single twist and turn just provided another horror that was guaranteed to kill you if you weren't quick or quick-witted enough. In fact, he actually wrote a whole little mini monster manual to go along with it, and just filled this thing with a whole bunch of new creatures that no one had ever seen before. So, you didn't know what to expect. And every single room in the Chamber of Caverns just goes from one deadly creature to another, until of course you get to the center where, after figuring out many traps, puzzles, and whatnot, you get to claim some pretty nice stuff. But it's also, one of these things where you also have a big boss battle at the end. So it's a long dungeon crawl. This isn't one that you just sit down and play in a weekend. This goes on for a while. But again, heavy hitter by Gary Gygax, number 4 on the list, Lost Caverns of Sajkant. Okay kids, I'm going to stop it at 5 because I could probably go on all day about this. But since we're going to stop it at 5, I'm going to jump ship and give you a non-TSR module. Okay, TSR was the company that produced Dungeons & Dragons, but there were other companies that produced material for Dungeons & Dragons back in the day. One such company was called Judges Guild, and this is one of their modules, The Dark Tower. Now, this is a pretty good story about an ancient evil, the cult of Set. The Egyptian cult of Set has apparently taken over a shrine to Mitra, and in doing so has, caused a bunch of stuff to happen within the land. And it's also caused the minions of Mitra to become a little upset. So the adventurers are basically wandering into a millennia-old religious conflict between the Lions of Mitra and the Sons of Set. It's just a very interesting dungeon crawl where you're caught between two competing factions, and there's a couple of little artifacts in here that produce some very unusual effects upon the party. So, again, one of my favorites, and I put it number 5 on the list. Judges Guild, The Dark Tower. Not to be confused with that Dark Tower. So, starting back in the 70s, and of course progressing on to today, there is Dragon Magazine. This is the official magazine of Dungeons & Dragons, and at the time, TSR. And this magazine would have contained a bunch of canonized material. New character classes, new spells to be used, basically new information that would be incorporated into the gameplay of Dungeons & Dragons. Eventually, yeah, I got it right here. A lot of that material ended up in this book, Unearthed Arcana. This is, I think, about 83. This, when they started up with the orange spines. So you would have had a good, healthy stack of these. You would have had a subscription. You would have been reading it off the shelf or whatever. And Dragon Magazine, apart from containing new character classes and spells and whatnot, would also have articles related to the gaming industry. They would naturally would have had advertisements for other games that TSR produced. Around Gen Con time, they'd actually have a schedule. And of course, you know, my favorite, they always in the back would carry a little comic and, you know, humor section. Dragon Mirth, a few little just like, you know, Far Side type comics. Wormy, which was a monthly run comic, basically about a dragon wargamer. Snarf Quest by Larry Elmore. And oh yeah, What's New with Phil and Dixie by Phil Foglio. Yeah, that's basically what Dragon Magazine was. You would get all of that, one issue every month. And of course, as I said, they eventually would throw it all into a hardback book. So, definitely something that would have been a part of your life as a Dungeons & Dragons player in the 80s. So if you were playing Dungeons & Dragons back in the 80s, and you were young enough to appreciate it, you might have collected some of these Dungeons & Dragons action figures. Now, unfortunately, your old Uncle Clockwork doesn't happen to have any here physically to show you, so I've got some pictures rolling. But I think it was a good marketing move by TSR to do a little expansion into the toy market. Really, they produced some good quality action figures, a play set or two. They had you know, a big Tiamat for sale. And really, it sort of got the younger kids interested in Dungeons & Dragons, you know, watching the cartoon. Got them interested enough to start playing the game when they got older. So I thought it was a good move. So if you wanted true Dungeons & Dragons experience, you might, you know, grab a couple of those to stick on your shelf. And that's it, kids, for this episode of Dungeons & Dragons 80s Style. Perhaps maybe later we'll check out some of these games. But until then, that's Uncle Clockwork, clocking out. We'll see you next time.